This episode of Quid Pros Quo is brought to you by Barter Toast.
One of the things that I've noticed as I've interacted with authors is that we come from all walks of life. For example, I'm an astrophysicist, and I've met authors who have had careers in fields as different as software development to city planning. Every author has a unique set of talents above and beyond those related to writing, and when you're independently publishing, it's important to leverage those skills. Unfortunately, there are so many parts to publishing that you will inevitably find that you don't have the talent or the skill set you need for that piece. For example, I am awful at drawing, and I'm not great at graphic design either, so I can't make character or cover art on my own. That's where Barter Toast comes in. Barter Toast is a place where you can swap your skills for help with things that you can't do on your own. Whether it's website design, audio editing, or marketing help you need, you can find it on Barter Toast. Once you find someone with the skills you need, you offer one of your skills to them in return. You might swap beta reading feedback for a character portrait, typesetting for website help, or a constructed language for a publicity boost. If you're ready to leverage your skills to take the next step in indie publishing, head to www.bartertoast.com to sign up and start bartering. That's www.bartertoast.com. I'll see you there.
Welcome to Quid Pros Quo, where creativity meets academia. Here, we're all about leveraging our love of academia to improve both your creative writing practice and ours. Whether you're honing your craft or just beginning your writing journey, we're here to share scholarly insights, inspiration, and advice that benefits us all. Let's get started. Hi, welcome to Quid Pros Quo. I'm Rin.
And I'm Zach.
And today we are talking about, can you create new fairy tales? And if you can, what are those elements that make a fairy tale? We're joined by our guest today, Paulee, Zach's wife, as our in-house folklore specialist. You'll remember her from our episode on historical consciousness, which is one of our most popular episodes to date, which is so cool.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that. Cool.
Last I checked, it's been a while since I checked, but last I checked, I don't think we're doing any better than we were when last I checked, so...
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, as we discussed in the first episode of this series, fairy tales are some of the oldest stories we have, and therefore it's hard to define what will last long enough to become folklore or fairy tales. Zach, do you want to talk about Lindy's Law?
Yes. So this is one of those heuristics that you come across in the social sciences. Although this is specifically referring to humanities, but it claims that as a rule of thumb, if a phenomena has lasted X amount of time, it will likely last X more years at least. As an example, if we were to apply this sort of thinking to Grimm's collection of fairy tales, we've had them for just over 200 years. So Lindy's Law would expect us to predict that it will be around for about another 200, but this isn't the greatest example considering the tales existed long before the Brothers Grimm collected them. The other thing to keep in mind is that with Lindy's Law, you kind of run into a Zeno's paradox thing, where as you move closer to the point where you would expect the thing, whatever it is that you're talking about, to become less relevant, the law would expect it to keep going forward. So That's why we call it a heuristic or a rule of thumb, because it's not a law like gravity.
Yeah. Let's get started with some questions, and we're going to open this up to Paulee and kind of a little roundtable discussion with the three of us. But what makes a fairy tale different from other types of stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, there are multiple different types of folklore, but when it comes to the spoken word, we have, at least what I was taught is that there are three main categories in the folklore field. And those are myths, legends, and folktales. So myths are, as defined by folklorists, myths are seen to be absolutely true by both the tellers and the listeners. So, for an example, in Christianity, the Adam and Eve story would be considered a myth. While that might make Christians uncomfortable to hear that, because in a lot of how we,
everyday...
Yeah, in everyday speech, kind of colloquially, we use myth in a very different way, where myth is something to be debunked. we would actually classify something like Adam and Eve or something that helps explain beliefs that people would see as true, that falls under the myth category. And it usually denotes something that is sacred, something that is told in a specific place. So I'm kind of really distilling that, but that's what a myth is. You have legends, which are still seen as, like, are still generally regarded as true. But they're placed in the context of time. They're not kind of outside of time the way myths are. And they aren't necessarily answering big questions, so there's a little bit more room for, we see it as generally true, but it might not be, this is the end-all be-all source of truth. So you'll kind of see this a lot more with indigenous beliefs where it's not distinctly, we are telling this only at one time. So like how leopards got their spots, why animals behave the way they do, why the seasons change. Those kinds of things, that there is still an element of truth and an observation about the world, but it's not necessarily like a core belief of this is what human nature is, or this is how the world works. And then folk tales, which fairy tales fall under, those are generally understood to be fiction by both the tellers and the listeners. So kind of an important element of that is you also know that you're not being lied to. There's not this pretense of one party or the other thinking that this is meant to be true. When you are engaging with a folk tale, and by extension a fairy tale, you are engaging with a land of make-believe. You are engaging with this suspension of disbelief willingly, so that you can either be entertained, or sometimes there's a moral value. But not necessarily. Morals are not necessary to a fairy tale. We kind of think of it more that way in a Western setting, where a lot of the fairy tales we grow up with, at least in America, there usually is some sort of moral, or there is some sort of lesson to be learned. But that doesn't have to be the case.
That makes sense. That's super cool. I've never heard these distinctions put this way, so that was really interesting to think through that.
Yeah, when I first started my position where I'm currently working, one of the folklore professors let me sit in on their here are the definitions class period, and that was really helpful because I also hadn't heard it that way. And it's very interesting to see that the field of folklore has a very robust system for when it comes to what we share with each other. There is room for all of it. There is room for the truths, and there is room for us suspending our belief together to create something mystical and magical just for fun. And there is also room for lies as well.
Yeah. That's awesome. Very cool. So then, this is a question that will kind of continue throughout the episode. Do you think new fairy tales can be created?
Ooh, that is a really good question. I think yes. I don't know. I have thoughts for yes and no.
Okay.
So I would say yes, in the sense of folklore is defined by its means of transmission. So folklore is not necessarily defined by what the content is, if that makes sense. It matters more that it's being passed along to others. So that's why folklore can encompass things like fairy tales and sacred rituals and myths. It's why it can encompass recipes and medicine, and in some respects oral history, and having accounts of people. What matters the most is that it continues to be perpetuated, and also this dynamic element where you are still going to see changes to it.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm trying to think of a good example for that. So, I guess one example would be I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many people will have heard of Johnny Appleseed. I'm assuming most Americans. But like you have this character of Johnny Appleseed who is kind of seen as this steward over the earth and is trying to do more to help the community, but also taking care of at least like the land where he lives, kind of thing. So you have something like Johnny Appleseed that is considered a character legend because you have this character that people recognize, but the way the stories are told about him, they are, one, getting passed around, and two, they are constantly changing. Like, you might have heard one version of the Johnny Appleseed story, I might have heard another. And we will generally, between the two of us, have a framework that does match, but there are going to be changes in the details. And then we go away and we go talk to other people and we share either what we've come up with together or our personal version that we had already heard. And that person will take in what we have said, and if they share it, it will change a little bit with them too. So I think it is possible to create new fairy tales. I think if we are thinking of it specifically strictly in the form of folklore, what will make it go from fairy tale to folktale is how we transmit it to others and what its longevity is, both in transmission and its ability to change and be dynamic. So I think a little bit of a yes and a little bit of a no there, where you can make a story and that will matter a lot. But if we're strictly going by defining fairy tale in the sense of folklore, there is also the constant retelling aspect that needs to be present.
One
Yeah.
of the things that we've talked about inside of this series in particular is about how copyright, which is something, copyright and intellectual property, which authors and creatives really care about, because of the way that it's currently structured inside of the United States and more broadly, it kind of puts a clamp down on that sort of retelling process that you just mentioned for stuff that is generated right now.
Yeah, that's true.
Whereas if you're looking at books that were published in the early 20th century, those have all passed into the public domain, and so you can have retellings based off of those books. Like The Wizard of Oz, for example, is one that we've come back to a couple of times.
Right.
So it sounds like, for one of the things that you're saying is that because of the requirements around transmission to become a fairy tale, that when you're thinking about fairy tales, when you have copyrighted works, it's harder for them to become fairy tales because they have to be relevant until the expiration of copyright to then be retold.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, where when it comes to the written word, folklore and I guess broader culture, pop culture, elite culture, usually the things that are getting written down and are thus claimed to copyright, that doesn't always play nice with folklore, and that doesn't play nice with transmission, as you pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that there is kind of a little gray area between what is written and the actual ideas themselves, where you really can't lay claim to archetypes and ideas under copyright.
Right.
So I think even though, yes, there would be definitely a barrier to trying to keep a certain strain or a certain narrative distilled enough that it can withstand time, I do think that there is a cultural element of ideas that you can still engage with, even if the exact one you were hoping to really jump on is stuck behind the copyright wall.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I think it will be interesting for future folklorists to see how many of our current folk tales that we tell, so chosen one narratives, particularly in a dystopian or post-apocalyptic setting.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not trying to claim that necessarily as folklore, but it would be interesting to me to see how many of those stories that we read, kind of like Hunger Games or, things that are currently so popular, I wonder if the more we talk about it and the more we have discourse around it, even if we don't see Katniss Everdeen as a character legend or a folk,
like a folk figure.
Yeah, like a folk figure. Even if we don't see something like that, we might very well see narratives that get passed down about kind of dystopian chosen one
societies that are split up into, like, I don't know, subgroups, whether they be districts or factions or whatever.
Yeah. Like, I think that we do have cultural ideas that have already shown themselves to be so strong in the written word, and I think we might even see that transfer more into the spoken word, especially through social media, where people are taking their ideas and their criticisms and their creativity and really running with that.
As you were talking about the kinds of stories that we tell about our copyrighted materials, it reminded me of like licensed role-playing games.
Yeah.
Where you have people who get around a table and they tell a story set inside of like the Star Wars universe or inside of the Mistborn setting, depending on the type of game that they're playing, and how the stories about the things that happen during the role-playing game can become a kind of folk tale amongst the subgroup.
Yeah.
And depending on how far those fairy tales how far those tales transmit, then they can come to be more transmitted in the same way that folk tales are.
Yeah, and you touched on another really important point where folklore can be as big or as small and niche as someone wants to study. So that is another important part where something being folklore is not defined necessarily by big national or international renown. It is defined by the fact that to the folk it represents. So to that D&D group and their families, to a mother and daughter that pass down recipes, no matter how big or how small that folk passing down the lore is, it still matters, and its transmission in and of itself is a success. So that is another really good point too, where fairy tales and the stories we tell with one another, it doesn't need to be a big, everybody is considered the folk and in on this. It can be smaller. So that is another really good thought too.
Wow, I feel so much smarter.
I know, me too. Our next question was like, are fairy tales the invention of the individual or the collective? But I feel like you kind of answered that wrapped up in your thing. Like, you have to tell the stories for it to be in folklore. So, even though an individual might come up with it, it doesn't become folklore until the collective has to say.
Right. And I think it definitely depends upon which definition and how we want to think of it. If we're thinking of fairy tales or stories or ideas as an extension of one person coming up with it, I do think that there are iterations that could be specifically tied to individuals. But I do think fairy tales, if we are looking at that in a folklore context, I do think it's inseparable from the collective.
For sure. So next we're going to move on to the elements of a fairy tale, and these mostly come from a Library of Scotland source, which we'll tag in the description, the show notes. So first up, we have a stock open and closed, and we shared some of these in the first episode of the series, and there's a Wikipedia page for that, and we can also link that in the show notes.
Yeah, another one of the kind of mainstays of the fairy tale as like a tale type in that sense of the word, rather than as like a transmission mode, is this idea of repetition. We often see this in the rule of three, where you have like 3 balls for Cinderella. You have 3 knights of spinning gold for Rumpelstiltskin. 3 bears, 3 pigs, like threes everywhere inside of fairy tales. But you also have other things like, 7 brothers, or sevens is also a very popular number in fairy tales. There's also an element of magic. And Rin, I actually have a question for you about this, because last week I had an interview, or I was interviewed by somebody, where we were discussing how in our modern vernacular, magic often is treated as if it were technology, where you have like the hard magic systems with the rules and the limitations and the powers, and you go through and you can make all the charts and everything. But I feel like, at least in many of the fairy tales that I'm used to, magic is much more of like an intrusion on the world that kind of appears and it does things and then it leaves. Like in Cinderella, we are never told, there's never any foreshadowing that there is a fairy godmother or any explanation of what the fairy godmother can do. Even though there are still limitations around her abilities, where she says, okay, here's the stuff that I'm going to give you, but it only lasts until midnight, kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think that generally when we look at, like, if we are going to use today's vernacular, fairy tales often have like a softer magic system, but I would say that it's characteristic to fairy tales to just have magic be othered. And I think the closest thing we get to like the same sense of otherness would be like the Latin kind of genre of magical realism.
Ooh, yeah.
Where something is like, well, it's not specifically Latin, but like, I think it originated in Latin America, right?
Right.
But I think of like Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is a story of slaves in the American South, and it's magical realism, and the house is like alive and haunted, and it's like, it's totally other to what we expect, even if it's like accepted in the world. Like, and it may be uncommon in the world or it may not be, but it's just, I think that element of otherness is really important to magic and fairy tales. Like, this is not something the common people get. It's something that you get if you are like especially good, like Cinderella.
Yeah.
Or maybe especially bad, like Hansel and Gretel, for like misbehaving, and you go into the woods and you find a witch who's going to eat you. Did I properly address that question?
Yes, I actually got to the end of it and realized that I had never put a question mark in there. So
okay, yeah, I was like wondering. I was like, I think this is the question he's asking. Perfect.
We're on the same wavelength.
Yeah, we got it. We've been doing this long enough. Another element of a fairy tale is there are generally archetypal characters and settings. For example, there's a hero character, a villain character, and maybe a helper character. And settings could be like a castle is very typical, or a forest or some kind of wilderness is very typical. Especially in like Grimm's fairy tales, you're looking at lots of castles and forests, because that was the landscape in Germany, is they had lots of castles and forests. Oh, go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, as we mentioned, I mean, we talked about this earlier, that in the West, we're used to our fairy tales having some kind of moral to them, but that's not necessarily a requirement.
Yeah.
It's just a form that we're used to when it comes to fairy tales. And then the other thing is that, because I think this hooks into the earlier conversation that we had about how, today, because of how copyright treats written material versus orally transmitted material, we're going to have repeated themes. One of the things that we look for inside of a fairy tale are recurring motifs. So things like giants or things of that nature. And in a prior episode, we talked about the ATU index. Have you heard of the ATU index?
Maybe. It's like Arthur something.
Arn Thompson Uther, but like the Arthur's kind of like in there.
I have heard of it, at least for how folklore is cataloged specifically in BYU special collections. I know that that came through a lot of studying of how Finland catalogs their kind of going by a Finnish indexing system, but that's either the same or closely related to ATU. I just
Okay.
haven't had a chance to really dive super deeply into either.
So valid. I think we were just curious if you had like firsthand experience with this.
Kind of. I worked with an intern this past semester, and she had done a lot more diving into different indexing systems for folklore, because it does get really tricky when, you know, you can kind of narrow down different motifs or you're seeing similarities, but then there are just enough changes that make all of these different accounts really their own thing. So I do know that ATU is supposed to be really helpful in kind of calling out, like, here are the major things and ways folklore items can be categorized, but I don't know super specifically how it's used.
Okay. Cool. That was a great answer.
I did want to add something, though,
Yeah.
in general, for the elements of a fairy tale. It is really interesting to me to see how many of those things listed as elements are also helpful devices for oral storytelling, where repetition is really helpful, and having archetypes and maybe not necessarily morals or lessons, but having motifs that, even if you don't remember exactly every detail, if you can get the repetition, you can get the main gist of characters and settings, and then you also remember main motifs or the way the story moves, you can still transmit a fairy tale orally pretty successfully.
Yeah.
That's
a really good point.
Yeah, that is a great point. When I was doing research for this, one of the things I came across was a classroom exercise for like children where you tell the fairy tale and then you wait a few days and then you have each child like tell the fairy tale again.
Ooh,
and
yeah.
you see like what changed, how they remember it, and like often they'll get the big strokes, so they may add some details or may take away some details, and then you tell the original like story that you read again, and then you like compare and contrast the new versions that the kids told. So I thought that was an interesting way to think about it, because kids especially are so inventive.
Mhm.
And a lot of things are getting passed down by like, I've heard it called kid culture, like Ring Around the Rosie. Like that's not the song like adults sing, really. It's just like kids playing, and because kids play together and the older kids teach the younger kids, it just gets passed down.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
a specific instance of folklore, I suppose.
Yeah, and they're actually, I know at least in my collection, we do have quite a bit of material that is based around like play and children's, like nursery rhymes, different playground games. So yeah, that transmission is, especially with children, that is a really thriving area of folklore to study, and it's very interesting to see with each generation of kid what gets retained and what doesn't.
Okay, this is kind of a tangent because I know that you dabbled in this in your younger days. But do you think things like creepypasta also fall into this category, since they're
Ooh.
often transmitted amongst kids?
Yes, that is such a good question. So, kind of an ongoing
Wait, can I pause real quick? Can we define creepypasta for those of us who may not know what creepypasta is?
I might not have the best definition, but at least from what I remember, creepypasta was, and maybe still is, I'm not sure how active the account is, but at least on YouTube, there was an account called Creepypasta, and they would tell different horror stories. Usually like urban horror, so things like,
Is Slenderman part of this?
I don't think so. They might have told a Slenderman story later, but I don't think it was what inspired
The original account.
Yeah, I don't know if it's what inspired the game or
Mm-hmm.
I don't. That's a little all things I engaged with, but I don't have the I don't have the timeline exactly. But I
Hey,
mean,
we
that
don't
just
need the
kind of
receipts.
adds to the folklore element of it. But so some creepypasta stories I remember hearing as like 12, 13-year-old. There was Jeff the Killer, there was the Rake, and I think the Rake is actually a broader horror story because I've also seen people from rural areas talk about the Rake, which is kind of like a golem-esque creature, but with like long, sharp, and deadly fingernails.
Disgusting. I hate
Yeah.
it.
So,
When you say golem, sorry, are we talking about like?
sorry, I'm talking Lord of the Rings golem,
Okay.
like little hunched over,
Yes.
like roughly the same size and proportions. But the Rake is a lot more dexterous and a lot more, I would say, more clever.
Oh.
And it's not engaging with people. Like, it is killing. It is not a figure. It's not a mischievous figure.
Not a trickster telling riddles.
Yeah, and it's not like a pitiful character the way Gollum is, where...
Yeah, it's like a malevolent figure.
Yeah, it is a malevolent figure. But I specifically heard those stories, like, on YouTube. So I don't fully remember if there was a different site, if there was somewhere you could read it. I don't know. But that, when I say creepypasta, I'm talking about that kind of internet urban legend horror that especially picked up in like the early 2010s. Especially with YouTube really picking up too. But as we enter a more digital world, there is kind of an ongoing debate between folklorists as far as what do we consider folklore and how do we group things. Because again, as I had mentioned, a lot of what determines folklore is the means of transmission rather than the content. And usually that means of transmission was seen as this needs to be happening face to face. But then you have things like Tumblr, you have things like YouTube, you have things like Twitter, where information and stories and jokes and memes, those are all getting passed around so quickly, and the timeline, both that dynamic nature and that transmission, are happening so fast now that it's hard to say it's not folklore, because you are still seeing how these things really blow up and mean something, and even if they go dormant for a little while, someone will, make some sort of joke, or it will come back and it will become funny again, or it will, like, creepypasta. Here I am talking about it in 2025, and I just shared the Rake and Jeff the Killer, and so that might inspire, like, a whole new round of that becoming relevant again. So, but then there are people who are arguing, no, it's not happening face to face, therefore it's not folklore. It's just another, whether it be pop culture or
Internet culture.
Internet culture. They argue that while there are some things in common with folklore, it's not necessarily folklore. I personally fall into the camp of it is. I think as we get more global and as we get more digital, I think face-to-face and connection has come to mean something different. Where I do think that there is something very powerful about being in person with people, but I don't think we should be discounting the connection that we have with other people that we're not immediately with. And I think that there is a very strong case for building up folk groups and building up connections with people, even if you aren't physically there with them. And I mean, memes are so prevalent, and they eke their way into real conversation and real in-person interactions.
even in like professional presentations, you'll have people put memes into their presentation or use a meme format.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I do think that even, I don't know, I personally think it overlaps so much with folklore that even if there's some distinctions, I think it is easier to think of it as folklore with a couple of oddities, which, when you're really getting into folklore, what doesn't have oddities, honestly? So I think something can have some unique elements, but still overall fall under the umbrella.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that it follows many of the same tropes, because when I think about internet culture, I can definitely think of like the stock characters that come up. For example, in certain segments of the internet, everybody's really focused on gorillas, mostly because of Harambe. But Harambe
Gone
is like
too soon.
Harambe is kind of like a character legend because he inspires all of these different things, where you have like weird trolley problem memes where it's like you kill Harambe so that everybody appreciates him, or do you not, so that Harambe can survive? Do you like the idea of Harambe more than actual live Harambe? Or the whole like who would win 100 men or a gorilla? I feel like that has to be related to Harambe somehow.
That's actually really funny. I didn't even think of that. It always comes back to Harambe.
But you could do other things like the snail, like the
immortal snail that can't touch you or you die, and it always knows where you are. Recently in my life, someone posted a lost meme in a Discord. And there were people who like had never heard of it, so then I pulled up the Wikipedia page and slapped it in the Discord, and then they were all like looking at all the Google images, trying to be like, have I seen any of these iterations? And some of them had and hadn't realized what it was, and some of them had never ever encountered loss in their life.
Wow.
Which was kind of crazy to me.
You have them unironically asking, is this lost?
Yeah, but it was like, I mean, technically they didn't even know what to call it. It was more what is lost, which is almost like what is love. Baby, don't hurt me no more.
I would sing it, but I'm worried that we're gonna get slapped with a...
Oh, you're so right.
Copyright.
Okay. We really want to ask this one. This one is going to be the longest, but the other two can be fast. How does this shift and change of fairy tales over time through oral retelling and oral tradition lead to revisionism in fairy tales? And if the revisionism leads like feminist fairy tales, can we still consider that feminist fairy tale true to the original, or is it even still a fairy tale?
So, kind of what I was talking about when we were talking about the internet, and what do we consider folklore when it comes to internet culture? I think that fairy tales, when we talk about being true to the fairy tale, I think there is also something very powerful about being true to the folk as well. So if a fairy tale is being used to now have either a modern context or modern morals or ideals, I think it's also valuable to consider that those changes are saying something about the folk now. And that the way that the fairy tale is changing and the way it's being transmitted now matters just as much as what the original was. So you kind of will see like headbutting between history and folklore in this way, at least for me, where...
Well, you're trained as a historian.
Yes. And it is hard because I see both sides as very compelling, where yes, you want to preserve the original, but when it comes to folklore, what matters is the fact that it can change, and that it can describe people as they are, and not just as who they were. Like, both matter, but I think fairy tales and watching them change and watching them take on new identities, I think that can bring discomfort, especially as it varies and changes from what we deem the original. But I think that's okay, and I think that that says a lot about who we are and where we're going, and that's all right. I guess I know we're running into a little bit of a time issue, but an example that comes to mind to me right now is the whole Snow White discourse, where Rachel Zegler got a lot of pushback for sharing her opinions about Snow White and Snow White not needing a man in the version that she's going to be in, even though my understanding is she still gets married? Question mark. I didn't actually see that.
I didn't see it either.
But you see Gal Gadot and Rachel Zegler in an interview a couple years back getting a lot of flack for having a very feminist view of Snow White. And for me personally, while I didn't ever get to the point of hating or canceling, for me it was kind of a clash with the 1930s Snow White, where I think it's really powerful that you have the very first Disney princess is this character of softness and gentleness, but also extreme endurance and perseverance, which is a version of Snow White that the Great Depression era American would need. And maybe in this day and age, we don't necessarily need the boss babe feminist Snow White, but if that's the version we're getting, there might be something important to explore there about why do we see this? And both of those versions are going to be very different from the Grimm recorded version, which is just Snow White as a girl. Not necessarily having, from what I remember, not necessarily having a super strong personality one way or another. You just kind of get more of that physical description. So, again, for better or for worse, or maybe for nothing at all, it's okay for things to change, and you know, how people feel about it just kind of adds to that wide spectrum of the context that goes into studying folklore.
That's super cool. You kind of touched on this, and we didn't talk about this a lot, but like often in fairy tales these days we think of like true love and true love's kiss. Do you think romance is an inherent fairy tale trait? Like, should it have been on our list of like fairy tale elements, or is it just in our day and age that we're so focused on romance, do you think?
I think that would fall. I think that could fall under a motif. And so putting it there as a motif means that if it's there, it joins a long storied tradition of other fairy tales that have romance. But if it's not there, it doesn't mean it's not a fairy tale. Because I mean, Hansel and Gretel, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Like, there's so many fairy tales that don't have romance and really don't, in my opinion, don't really need it. Or you start seeing other forms of love, familial love, things like that. So maybe we could make an argument that love is an inherent fairy tale trait somewhere, but
or the lack thereof.
Or the lack thereof.
Yeah, I was going to say, because Hansel and Gretel probably has a severe lack of love.
Sibling rivalry.
I mean, a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. So, I don't know. I think romance can solidly fall under a motif that is common, but I don't necessarily think it's inherent to making something a fairy tale.
Okay, makes sense. And then finally, last question, give us like 2 or 3. What are some of your favorite modern day fairy tales or fairy tale retellings?
Oh, that's a really good question.
This is supposed to be the fun one.
Oh, I was not ready. So I will say, I personally have a story idea that I've actually really been struggling with. I love Beauty and the Beast. That was one of my favorites. Like, the Disney animated version was one of my favorites as a kid. So I'm currently trying to work on a fairy tale retelling that mixes both Beauty and the Beast with Red Riding Hood, where I have Red Riding Hood and Belle as sisters, and you see them kind of still having their own stories,
Yeah. Oh,
but
I love that already.
I know. What's hard is I can see it, but every time I try to write it, I can't quite make it mesh. So we will see what happens with that.
We should go and do a
Another.
brainstorming session. I would love to help you brainstorm that.
Oh, I would appreciate that.
Let's go! Okay, sorry. Another one.
Another fairy tale retelling that I really liked. I can't remember the name of this author. Maybe I do. I think it was Jessica Day George.
Oh, yeah. She does a lot of good fairy tale retellings.
Yeah, so I loved the 12 Dancing Princesses retelling. Yes, it is Jessica Day George. Yes. Yeah. So you have the 3 Dancing Princesses, and then I think the other one was Cinderella. But she also wrote a book.
East of the Sun, West of the Moon?
Yes.
Yeah! Oh my god, it's so good.
I know the sun and the moon are in there, and I know there are cardinal directions. Yes. I haven't read it in years, but I really loved that one. Just now remembering that I apparently went on a huge 12 Dancing Princesses kick as a teenager, because I also love the book Entwined by Heather Dixon.
I don't know that one.
It's not as well known, but it's so, so good. And I like that one because you also kind of get a darker... I think of it as a very wholesome and light story still, but you do kind of get a darker twist to 12 Dancing Princesses. So I kind of liked that, not quite horror element, but a little bit more of that spooky, unsettling feeling. But then it still has that kind of stereotypical fairy tale feeling where everything is right in the end and there is a happy ending. But
for sure,
love Entwined.
Did you ever read The 13th Princess by Diane Zoller?
No.
Okay, it's also 12 Dancing Princesses. That was my 12 Dancing Princesses book.
Ooh, I'll have to look into that one.
Okay, we are going to do our homework and then wrap up because we are at 47 minutes. Listeners, your homework is to write a flash fiction fairy tale. Include at least one element from the ATU index and make sure to start with Once Upon a Time or another classic fairy tale opening. And then you can send that to quidprosquo@gmail.com or leave it in the comments or whatever you wish. But we would love to see your homework. Paulee, thank you so much for being on the show again. We love having you.
Thank you for having me. It's so fun. I love this.
Yeah. It's a blast. Thank you so much. Okay, Zach, do you want to take us out?
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been Quid Pros Quo. We'll see you next time.
Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and CK Jensen. If you liked this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today.